Stanford University.
My name is Mitchell Stevens. I'm a sociologist and a faculty member in the Graduate School of Education here. I study organizational change in higher education. It's a very good time to be me. And the best part is I get to be me at a university that is fully committed to helping the world understand the current revolution underway in teaching and learning. That revolution is happening for teaching and learning in all age contexts, in all life settings, worldwide. And it's only partly a technological revolution. People in Silicon Valley like to focus on the technological components of change, but what we're living through at this moment is at least as much a political, financial, and cognitive shift in how teaching and learning are experienced, paid for, governed, and fitted into the rest of life. Figuring out how those different components of revolution ought to fit together is a very large intellectual problem. A lot of heads and a lot of articulate people are going to have to be involved in that conversation, which is why I'm so pleased to see so many smart and articulate people in front of me this afternoon. And also to turn the rest of the hour over to Stephanie Banchero and Tom Friedman. Here we go, guys.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. So I want to thank you all for coming here. I was just telling Tom that when I was preparing to question him, I thought, oh, it's going to be an interesting conversation, fun. And then I went to this event this morning where I was talking to some people who, what we call advocates, people who, do PR. And they said, oh my God, are you nervous? You have to interview Thomas Friedman. Oh my God. I was like, no, I don't think so. Oh my God, he's the most brilliant man in America. And I was like, well, now I am nervous. So if I seem a little bit nervous, it's because people have made me that way. Oops. So I don't think there's anybody in this room who does not know who Tom Friedman is, but just in case, I'm going to tell you who he is. He, I'm sure you all know, writes a column for the New York Times. He's written some brilliant and best-selling novels, From Beirut to Jerusalem.
Not novels.
I'm sorry, books.
I hope not.
From Beirut to Jerusalem, The World is Flat, and then the most recent one, That Used to Be Us. And I imagine there's many of you in the education world who has read The World is Flat. Tom joined the New York Times in 1981. He became the bureau chief in Beirut in 1982. And then he moved to Jerusalem in 1984, where he became the bureau chief there, and he served there until 1988. He's a bit of a slacker. He's won only 3 Pulitzers, but he's young. So I have a special affinity for Tom for 2 reasons. First, he wrote a column recently where he said that when he came to Washington in 1988, the hot beat was national security and the State Department. But he said, if I were a cub reporter today, I'd still want to be covering the epicenter of national security, but that would be the Education Department. So he, like us, knows that education, focus on education is the most important thing. But more importantly, my affinity for Tom comes from his recent column where he said that he prodded Arnie Duncan to finally admit that, yes, he had considered a life as an erotic dancer. Mm-hmm. Tom wrote a column in November, which I'm sure many of you saw because it got quite a lot of play. He wrote a column in November suggesting that Obama should name Arnie as Secretary of Education to replace Hillary Clinton.
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, sorry. About the same time, The Onion wrote sort of a, obviously, tongue-in-cheek column saying that Arnie was moonlighting as an erotic dancer at the nightclub Peaches under the stage name Velvet. So all of these things together had Arnie admitting publicly that, yes, he said, quote, yes, The Onion was probably more accurate than Tom. And he tweeted, stripping was my secret plan B if we lost the election. So I've been covering Arnie for 10 years, never could get him to admit it. So we owe Tom a big thanks for that. But on a more serious note, I think what's so great about Tom is that he's helped the nation and the world really understand how to connect economic sustainability, growth, national security, and education, which is what a lot of us care mainly about. But he's been able to connect it in a way that most people can't. In the column about Arnie, he wrote, "The biggest issue in the world today is growth. And in this information age, improving educational outcomes for more young people is now the most important lever for increasing economic growth and narrowing income inequality. In other words, education is now the key to sustainable power." So I just want to start with that, and maybe you could talk a bit more, explain that. How is education the key to sustainable power?
Well, first of all, thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for inviting me to the Ed Writers. My wife chairs a charter boarding school in Washington, D.C. My daughter was a TFA Corps member and a teacher in the D.C. school system. She's now out here at Stanford Business School. So education is a big subject in our house, and we read Education Week every week. I don't know if the Ed Week reporter is here, but we're addicted to Education Week. So what am I doing here at an Education Writers? This is not the Council on Foreign Relations, and of course I'm not an educator. I just play one on TV. And I'm here because actually I really do cover power. I cover national power and the contest for power globally. My technical title is Foreign Affairs Columnist for the New York Times. But it's very obvious to anyone that, as I said in that column, economic growth is the main driver of power today. And education/innovation is the key to economic growth and building an economy based on more and more good jobs for growing middle classes. And so I just kept working backwards. Well, if that's the case, then how do you get better educational outcomes? Well, if that's the case, how do what's this education reform revolution all about? And if that's the case, that's kind of interesting. So that's how I got to education, basically, but starting with power and working backwards. And that's why we wrote that in my last book, that if we had Hillary Clinton come to us and said, President Obama has asked me to be Secretary of State, what should I tell him? And we would have told her that, tell him, Mr. President, I'm really honored, but I'd actually like the top national security job. I'd like to be Secretary of Education. Because I really think, I'm exaggerating the role, unfortunately, Secretary of Education in our society because it's so much more decentralized. But the point is, I really believe education is the key to driving economic growth and closing income inequality, or narrowing it. And that's how I've gotten into it. It also is, this is a terrible time to be Secretary of State, frankly. And so that means derivatively, it's actually a terrible time to be foreign policy writer. Because on a good day as Secretary of State, you get to deal with Putin, who thinks he was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple. He sits on a mountain of oil and gas, so doesn't have to pay attention to anything we do. When he doesn't talk to you, get to talk to the Chinese, who we owe $1 gazillion. And those are just the people who answer the phone. And the rest are, think about the Middle East, a collection of really troubled, struggling countries. And so it isn't an accident that we have not had a consequential Secretary of State since the end of the Cold War. In the sense of really being able to reshape, the global agenda. Whereas in education, Arnie Duncan is someone who is really driving a national conversation. So at a kind of intellectual level, for a columnist and reporter, I find all these issues extremely interesting and engaging, and where you can actually see people moving the needle, which you can't see in foreign policy today. Try moving the needle on Syria. So that's a little bit what got me here.
What do you think is holding America back?
Well, that's it's a big question. We just wrote a book about that last year called That Used to Be Us, How America Lost Its Way and the World It Invented and How We Can't Come Back. So this is a big concern of mine. Well, I would start by saying that, so I do everything inductively. I got to education because I really tried to answer that question, and that took me basically into companies and trying to understand who were the employers were looking for. And that in turn, well, if that's the employee you're looking for, that then brought me into education. Are we producing those kind of employees, et cetera? So it's another one of those regressions. So I would say macro, what's holding us back is the most dangerous thing a species or country can do is misread its environment. Countries and species that misread their environment things don't tend to end well. And I would argue we misread our environment at the end of the Cold War in two fundamental ways. One was that we thought the end of the Cold War was a huge victory that allowed us to put our feet up. In fact, it was a huge victory. But it did not allow us to put our feet up because it was a victory that basically unleashed the power, potential, and aspirations of 2 billion people just like us. And they were like a champagne bottle that had been shaken for 50 years and the cork was taken out. And you don't want to get in the way of that cork. And so we just, at the end of the Cold War, wanted to put our feet up right when 2 billion people wanted to start to race. At the same time, we did that in the first decade at the end of the Cold War. And the second decade, we basically spent chasing, this is the decade after 9/11. Tragically, maybe necessarily, that's a subject of great debate. We spent the second decade, the first decade of the 21st century, chasing the losers from globalization rather than the winners. So we chased Al-Qaeda and the Taliban rather than India, China, and Brazil. So that is what I call misreading our environment. The third thing, I am by nature, I'm a reporter, and so, but I'm really I see myself as kind of a plumber. I'm really always interested in what's going on in the plumbing, in this case, the technology, because when you understand what the technology empowers and enables, really tells you a lot. And I've been accused of being a technological determinist, and there's a little bit of truth in that. That is, I do believe capabilities create intentions, and so when you understand what the capabilities are, how they're changing, you understand a lot of what can and can't be done. So we have also, I think America today faces three great challenges. One is debt deficit entitlements. You know all about that. I won't talk about it. Second is energy and climate, how we power future middle classes in a sustainable way. But the third, and the one I will talk about for a second, is the biggest thing happening in the world today that we are not talking about. And I believe it's the driver of everything, and that is the merger of globalization and the IT revolution. So I believe the two have merged in a fundamental and fascinating way where more globalization is driving more IT is driving more globalization. And so very quietly over the last decade, I believe the world's gone through a huge inflection point where it went actually we went from a connected world to a hyper-connected world over the past just 7-8 years. But it was completely disguised by the subprime crisis and the post-9/11 war on terrorism. So actually the biggest thing has been going on beneath the surface, and we're all feeling it. It's driving the whole ed reform revolution. It's being felt by every workplace, every industry, every boss and every employee, and every educator and every university. But it's actually not a subject of our national conversation. So as I said, we've gone from a connected world to a hyper-connected world. And I'm very sensitive to this, and some of you probably heard my soundbite on it, because in 2011 I wrote That Used to Be Us. In 2004, I wrote The World is Flat, just arguing the world was getting connected. So when I sat down to write the new book in 2011, the first thing I did was get the first edition of The World is Flat off my bookshelf, just to see what I'd written. And I forgot. And took it off the bookshelf. I opened up to the index, looked under A, B, C, D, E, F, F, A. Facebook wasn't in it. So when I was running around the world saying the world is flat, we're all connected. Facebook didn't exist. Twitter was still a sound. The cloud was still in the sky. 4G was a parking place. LinkedIn was a prison. Applications what you sent to college. Big data was a rap star. And Skype was a typo. Okay?
That is a good soundbite.
Okay. So think about it, all of that happened in just the last 7 years, for me, between one book and another. Now that is no difference in degree, that's a difference in kind. And think about MOOCs. MOOCs are riding on that new platform. MOOCs are riding on a hyper-connected world. They couldn't have worked in just a connected world. And so many other changes as well. So to me, that's the big thing that's happened that no one is discussing, but everyone is living and feeling. So when the world gets this hyper-connected, I believe the net effect of it is that it's as if the whole world were a single math class at Stanford or anywhere else, and the whole global curve just rose. Because in a hyper-connected world, every boss has cheaper, easier, faster, more efficient access to more above-average automation, software, and robotics, above-average cheap labor, and above-average cheap genius. Hence my argument that the single most important socioeconomic fact of our time is that average is officially over. Average is over. You know that old saying in Texas, if all you ever do is all you've ever done, all you ever get is all you ever got? That is, as they say, NA, no longer applicable. Woody Allen's line, 90% of life is just showing up, also NA. If you just show up, you will not get average anymore. You will get below average. So I'll just end this point by saying, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking very easy for you to say, Mr. Smarty Pants, New York Times columnist. No, let me tell you about my life. I became the New York Times foreign affairs columnist in January 1995. And I actually inherited James Reston's office in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. What a great honor and thrill to have the office of this great columnist and editor. So I thought about that, and I realized that, you know, Mr. Reston probably came to the office every day back in the 60s and 70s and would say to himself, I wonder what my 7 competitors are going to write today. And he personally knew all 7. I know them. Walter Lippmann, Mary McGrory, Stuart Alsop, Joseph Kraft, I can name them. I do the same thing, Stephanie. I come to my office every morning, same office as Reston, and I say to myself, I wonder what my 70 million competitors are going to write today. Okay. I have 70 million competitors. Okay. And I'm keenly aware of that. So a few months back, New York Times opened newyorktimes.com.cn, New York Times in Chinese. So we have a Chinese language edition of New York Times online. And they translate my column and Krugman's column, and a big summary of the news. So 20 years ago, I used to go to China. I had one goal when I went to China, 20 years ago. And that was to tell my mother-in-law in Chicago something she didn't know about China. As it happens, my mother-in-law in Chicago had never been to China. So that was a relatively easy task. I could go, I could write, frankly, I hope I didn't, but I could write an average column. When my column's in Chinese, twice a week, my goal is very different. It's not to write a column that will tell my mother-in-law in Chicago something she doesn't know about China. My goal now is to tell people in Chengdu something they don't know about China. That is a wholly different task. That requires a level of insight, preparation, reporting that is totally not average. And so average is over for me, for you, for everybody else. And I believe that socioeconomic fact is what's driving a lot of the anxiety, a lot of the pressure, and a lot of the revolution we're feeling right now.
So you said that after the Cold War, we sort of laid back, rested on our laurels, and sort of weren't competing with the right folks. So I'm curious. I see that's obviously an entire national issue.
It's a gross generalization, but it's,
there's
a lot to it.
Right, but I mean, in education, do you think education missed? Were they asleep? I mean, why isn't there as much innovation as education as there should be? I mean, what is the resistant force to it happening? Or do you think I'm assuming you think there's not enough of it?
Well, I think now, I mean, I'm here in town because I was at the New School Summit, and there's an explosion of education happening now. And I think because people are feeling this. And so I'm a big believer in markets. The market's demanding it. Parents are demanding it. Students are demanding it. Not everywhere equally all the time. And the federal government's demanding it. So started with Bush and No Child Left Behind, and has gone on to this administration. So I think the demand is really there, and I think it's only going to intensify. Now, I'm a big believer in platforms and in that platforms of innovation. And so what I think is exciting about Common Core is that we now have a platform that people can write apps on across a 50-state basic community. And so I think we're just at the beginning of a whole new stage in this revolution. I think you'll see a huge amount of innovation coming off the Common Core in terms of applications. Now you have an audience. Instead of trying to write for every school district or every state, you can write apps across the whole country. So I think it's going to unlock a huge amount of innovation.
But you mentioned MOOCs, and I think you've written in your column that you imagine in 5 years they could really change sort of the access and the graduation rates, maybe. Can you talk a little bit about sort of where you see, what you think of MOOCs now, just for people who might not know, and then what you think they can be in 5 years, or even 2 years, what they could be?
Yeah, I really think, again, I think this is the beginning of a real revolution, because for any number of reasons. One is, first of all, I think everyone's got to keep in mind, MOOCs are in their Alta Vista stage. Google hasn't even been invented yet. So this is right, they're in the garage still. They haven't come out of the garage, or they're just about to do it. Because you read a lot of criticism, I see this in the ed press sometime, only 10% of those kids, who start a MOOC, finish a MOOC. By the way, I think that completely misses the point, because you have a lot of older adults who just want to listen in on a lecture and be educated. You have no idea how someone might be inspired by watching one of these, whether they take the test or not. So I wouldn't get too caught up in that statistic. I think there's a tendency to see that as something that is necessarily a certain downside. Education has higher education has gotten too expensive. There's no longer a connection between the price you pay for that average of kind of $200,000 a year for a private liberal arts education and the job, $200,000 for 4 years, excuse me, and the job and return you can hope to get on that in the near future. So let's go back. Again, let's try to put it in context. What happened is when the world got hyper-connected, so every middle-class job started to go 3 directions at once. It started to go up. It required more education to get. It started to go out. More people in the world could compete for that job, and machines and software. And it started to go down. It started to be outsourced to history, become obsolete faster. So every job's going like this, much, much faster. So what happened in industry was industry intuited that universities, community colleges, were actually not sending them people with the skills they wanted. And that created a source of frustration for them. So whether you were Google or you were Caterpillar, what they started to do was to demand certificates, basically. You want to work for Google now, a college degree is no longer a proxy for your right to be hired at Google. So they discovered there was actually a disconnect between straight A's in college, or there was no real correlation between straight A's in college and a 4-year degree and the kind of employee they wanted. So they started chafing, and they started demanding new forms of certification. There's an explosion of this going on around the country. And at the same time, I think university or students and parents will realize I'm paying all this money, and I'm actually not getting the certificate I need to get a good job. And into this comes the MOOC, thanks to the hyperconnecting in the world, that says I can now give you access to the best educators in the world in any number of fields at a price point that will allow you to flip a classroom and basically use your teachers in a so much more effective way, much more as tutors, coaches, enablers, and inspirers. So this is coming, and I think it's going to be huge. I think you ignore this revolution at your peril. It makes too much sense, particularly for a community college and particularly for the developing world.
Do you, given the politics of education, I guess, so there's a vision of what it could be. What do you see are the forces that could either stop it or slow it down dramatically? Or maybe there aren't.
I wrote the first story or column about Coursera. Mm-hmm. It's not even, I saw Daphne Kohler last night, and we were joking, it isn't the first anniversary of that column yet. Because I wrote it in May, I think it was May 15th of last year. In that column, they had 4 schools and 260,000 students. Yesterday, she was telling me they have 3.2 million students. They have now 80 foreign universities. They have a couple hundred American universities signed up. This is before the first anniversary so this thing is scaling really fast. Mm-hmm. And again, don't take this iteration, the Alta Vista stage, as the final thing. I think we're just going to get the technology perfected. So there's a great access opportunity here. Imagine for US foreign policy, if you're head of AID, Agency for International Development, you can imagine now renting rooms in Upper Egypt, in a town in Upper Egypt, in Luxor. You can rent a dilapidated old building, fill it with 100 chairs, buy 100 laptops, rent a satellite internet uplink, hire 12 teachers, English, Arabic speakers, and just invite every kid in Luxor to get the education he wants anywhere in the world, courtesy of the US government. It's a lot better than selling them F-16s, and imagine the opportunities that we can do to bring access. I also think, it's always struck me as odd, I take public speaking seriously, I enjoy doing it, that you need I think you need a license to teach kindergarten in this country, in a public school, but you do not need a license to teach physics at any university. You don't have to prove any pedagogical skill to do it. So you can write your lecture and stand up there in the class and read your lecture about physics and quantum mechanics, and it can be really boring, and those kids who paid $50,000 a year to go there are just stuck with you. And now that professor is going to have competition from somebody who knows how to make physics exciting, engaging, and everyone's going to have to work on their pedagogy.
There's probably some people in the audience here who are going to want to say something about that. Do you see any sort of similar disruptive force that could happen in K-12?
I think MOOCs will be coming to a K-12 near you, and we were talking about that backstage, and I would only echo what you said. I mean, we're going to identify the 12 best teachers who can teach fractions to third graders through this system. And when we do, I think their lessons are going to scale out, and either they're going to be copied and amplified, and many teachers will learn from them and improve their pedagogy, or we'll just use them, and the teacher will be able to spend so much more time working with each student. So the logic of it, I think, will move right through the system.
So Tom wrote a column yesterday, I'm sure you, well, maybe you all saw it. It was called the 401, what was the title?
We're in a 401k world.
We're in a 401k world. And it talked a lot about sort of everything is individualized now. So I'm curious about, when you envision what you think K-12, let's do K-12 first and then maybe higher ed, what that will look like in this individualized world. Is it something like every child is sitting at home taking an algebra MOOC, and I mean nobody ever goes to campus? I mean, what is sort of, there's a lot of sort of talk about up here, and I'm just curious about, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but what does that look like?
Sure. Well, you can't be married to a school teacher and think that that's the right model. You know what I mean? So I don't believe in that at all. To me, it's all about flipped classroom, hybrid model. It's getting the best of both. I still hugely believe. Not only do I hugely believe in teachers, I actually believe their role will be more important than ever. It will take on some different attributes, though. And so maybe let me just go through the logic of that column. So I wrote a column basically saying that everywhere I go today in the world, I'm really struck at how many people tell me, my world is changing. My world is changing, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And so what I said is, I think this might be what's going on. We're in a 401k world now, where everyone has to pass the bar exam, and no one can escape the most email list. Okay. So what did I mean by that? That what happens when the world gets this hyper-connected is, if you could imagine a meter that said, your world will be governed by defined benefits or defined contributions. So at the New York Times, we had a defined benefit pension plan. I've been at the New York Times since '81, so 32 years. So for 30 years, we had a defined benefit. I showed up at the New York Times for 32 straight years, and that meant they defined the benefits I would get by year 32. It was a nice deal. I never thought about it. Never thought about anything. 2 years ago, they announced that's the end of defined benefits. Now it's going to be a defined contribution world. You will get so much for a contribution, and you will decide how to invest it. And I think that move from a defined benefits world to a defined contributions world is happening everywhere. I'm not talking just about pensions. That you will increasingly face a world. The good news, no more ceilings. Wow, in a world of MOOCs, of online learning, of Khan Academy, I can go anywhere now. And if I have the motivation and the will and the persistence and the grit, I can take myself so far wherever I am, whether I'm in Hayward or in Stanford. The bad news is there's no floors or walls either to protect you in the way we had before. So if we're going from a defined benefits world to a defined contributions world, I think the education to work system has to fundamentally change. Where government, like if you turn on late night TV, you'll find 10 people who will tell you how to invest your 401k. So we figured that out. We figured how to coach people how to invest in their pension. But we have almost nothing for how people invest in themselves. How do you invest in your own education, your own skill, your own human capital? By the way, in a world now where you can actually invest in yourself in so many ways, so many new ways, online, for free. We're doing nothing or very little to basically inform people how to do that, how to invest in themselves in a defined contribution world where, you know, how much you invest in yourself will matter more than ever. At the same time, the soft skills that teachers impart, that school imparts, particularly inspiration, motivation, and self-motivation, those are going to become more important than ever. Because if it's a defined contribution world, I just can't skate my way, you know, through school. So much is going to have to depend on me and my motivation. I'm here today as a journalist because I had an incredibly inspiring journalism teacher at 10th grade at St. Louis Park High School in room 313. And her name was Hattie Steinberg, and the only journalism course I've ever taken in my life was hers. And it's not because I was that good, it's because she was that good. And that teacher changed my life. I still hugely believe in that role of teachers, and I believe in it's going to be even more important in a world of defined contributions. Well, I said it's a world of defined contributions where everyone has to pass the bar. That's the point I was making before, where you see what's going to happen very shortly is the companies, Tony Wagner has this line, the world doesn't care what you know, because the Google machine knows everything. The world only cares what you can do with what you know. Mm-hmm. And we're very close to a world where I can acquire the competencies to do with what I know outside of all the traditional channels we've thought of. And I think the next big revolution in education is how I brand those competencies, how I get those competencies certified. Because I've just been sitting home taking MOOCs, but man, I'm a killer now in accounting, you know, but I haven't gone through any accounting class. I need a way to translate that, all those competencies I've acquired, so I can then go to a company and basically get hired, even though I have none of the traditional, you know, proxies for that knowledge. I think that's the next revolution. And so that's why I say everyone's going to have to pass the bar. Just as the law world decided 50 years ago or whenever that just having a law degree was not a proxy for knowing the law, you actually had to have a law degree and then pass the bar. I think that's going to happen across the board.
So I wonder...
Just one last point, and that's the last one. Everyone faces the most email list. So we have on NewYorkTimes.com, right side of the page, the most email list. You can see the 20 most popular stories or columns in the New York Times on any day. Any journalist who tells you they don't look at the most email list every morning is a liar, okay? Because you can't ignore it, you know? I mean, it's there. What's happening is, through the cloud and big data, everyone now has the most email list. I started thinking about this because my wife was reading Ed Week, and she said, oh, look at this story, it's very interesting. There's now technology that can track whether a teacher has her third graders on grade level in math every day and every week. So how long before someone turns that into a electronic, you know, bulletin board of who's got their third graders on grade level every day, every week? So you got schoolloop.com now, mm-hmm. where I can see my kids' assignments every day, and I can see their attendance record every day, and I can see their homework every day. So what big data is going to do is put everyone on an email list. And that's then going to be connected up to your pay and salary. Now, let me just say one last thing. I find all this really scary. Okay, do not confuse my sort of analytical interest in connecting the dots with approval or disapproval. The only thing I can tell you is I didn't do this, I swear, okay? Because a lot of people confuse my writing about it with thinking I did it or I approve it. I'm really just trying to understand it, because understanding it leads to what I think is what politics should be about, which is getting the most out of it and cushioning the worst. Because any revolution like this will have winners and losers, sometimes between groups and sometimes within people themselves.
Right. Well, so that was what I was, I'm sure you knew I was going there. I mean, I wonder
trying to
if
preempt you.
Right, exactly, I knew it. If the floor is falling too fast and the walls are going away too quickly, I mean, education for a long time was sort of seen as guiding people. You come here, we help you, and kids need help, and, you know, sometimes they can't get it at home. You said it scares you, so I'm curious about how do we guard against that we're going from, okay, we're here where we're sort of, the ceiling is going off very quickly and we're maybe quickly trying to get into it, to where we go over to here where we're like, oh my gosh, the floor fell out so fast and we didn't notice it. So I think there's this main area where people live, and you know, and years ago it probably would have been a couple of years, but now with technology. It's probably going to be a couple months. So how do we navigate that space?
Well, I don't want to even pretend I have the answers for all that. I don't want to take a few stabs at it. My job, as I see, is partly just describing what's going on. Then I start to investigate who's doing what to enable people. So I alluded to one, before. I don't know if you're familiar with the Hope Street Group, started by Byron and Geese, co-founded by him from McKinsey, who's head of McKinsey's social sector. So what Hope Street is all about is how do we get the right policies now in a world where I have to invest more in myself? How do we get the right policies that give people the resources and knowledge to do that at speed, scope, and scale? So people are now trying to think about that. That's one thing. One thing we know for sure, just you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Unemployment for people with four-year college degrees is about 3.6% last time I checked. That's basically no unemployment. Unemployment for people with two-year, it's about 6 or 7. A high school degree, no college degree, is about 7 or 8. No high school degree, they say it's 10 or 12. It's probably infinity, So what does that tell you? It tells you something very crude that I think is very important, that the more knowledge you have, the more education you have, the better chance you will get some kind of job, okay? And I see this with my daughter's friends, that my daughter's friends I describe as, in my youngest daughter, as half are on career tracks and half just have jobs. And I think that's really the sad thing that I'm seeing in this generation
Explain
right
that
now.
a little bit more.
Well, I mean that, so, half are really, my daughter wanted to be in journalism. She works for NPR, so she's on a career track. She has friends who maybe are teaching English, overseas. They're not really on what there's career, but they're having experience, and that's actually great too. But they're not yet on a career track. So I think there's a lot of young people just out of college in the last 4 or 5 years since the Great Recession. They have jobs, but they're not on a career track in the way, like when I graduated from college, I said, well, see, what do I want to do? I want to go into academics, be a journalist. Oh, I want to be a journalist. I'll apply at AP and UPI. Didn't get hired by AP, got hired by UPI. It never occurred to me I wouldn't be able to launch some kind of career. Whereas I think a lot of young people that don't have that opportunity right now. And that's why one of the points I've been stressing is I'm old fuddy-duddy. I'm 59. When I got out of college, I got to find a job. I see that my daughter's friends have to invent a job.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.